In this section, I'm going to introduce the exit app command. Now, before I do that, though, I'm going to have to add a little bit of context. Now, with programming, things tend to lean on other things. So in order to understand one thing, you have to understand other things and then understand other things following that. I made a quick illustration to show you, to demonstrate what I'm talking about. But let's say that I want to teach you A, or you want to learn A. So we have our topic, we call it A, and I quickly find out, or you quickly find out, that in order to fully understand A and everything that you can do with it, you also must know B. So you go, okay, fine, I'll go and learn B. When you start learning B, you find out quickly that in order to actually understand everything that's going on with B, you also must know C. So you go, okay, I'm going to go and learn C, and then that way I'll know B, and then that way I'll know A. But then you find out that in order to know C, you have to fully know A. So you get into this cycle where you don't really, in order to know A, you need to know B. In order to know B, you need to know C, and everything's sort of built upon each other. Well, when I teach these, I have to keep that in mind as well, that I can't, in order for me to fully teach one thing, I have to have already covered topics that are related to B, and then in order to do B, I have to do C. So what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to just cover what I can, and then as we go through the tutorials, as it relates back to the first topics, then we're going to bring those along with it. So for example, with the exit app. And gradually you will end up learning everything that you can about everything that we're talking about. So here we go. We have our script set up with a single instance for, so that way we don't have to keep constantly dealing with that dialog box, because every single time we run it, it will just close out the old instance and start with a new one. And we also have persistent to keep it persistent in memory. So we're going to go ahead and run this. And if I look down here, I can see that this is another program. I can see that I have my script running. Okay, so let's say for whatever reason that it's doing its tasks, it's doing whatever, and then once it's done those tasks, what I want to do is exit on its own. I don't want to have to come down here and close it manually. So, like we discussed in a previous part of this tutorial, we talked about the auto execute area. So let's say that I'm working within the auto execute area of my script. So this is before it hits a hotkey or a return, etc., etc. So, and we'll cover those at, like I said, it's all that cycle thing. So let's say that once it's completed these lists of tasks, or these tasks that I have it set out to do, I want it to exit on its own. So what I'll do if that's the case is I would just type in here exit app. So now it's going to perform whatever tasks I've told it to do, and then once it hits this line right here, it's going to close our script. So if I go ahead and save it, let me comment this out first. I'll do it one more time without it. And if we look, we have our script running. If I include this back in and run it again, this time it'll, as soon as it hits this line, it's going to exit our script. And there we go. I ran it and it stopped. I ran it and it stopped on its own. Okay, so that's it for exit app, and like I said, we'll be bringing this back throughout the rest of this particular section of the tutorial. In this section, we're going to take a look at the message box, and as stated in the previous section, I'm not going to be able to cover everything to do with the message box in this, because it'll relate to topics that we haven't yet covered, and it's just going to add a lot of confusion. So I'll cover whatever I can with the message box here, and then as we go through the following tutorials, I think tutorial number 2, I'll probably be able to cover everything that you need to know about messagebox, or finish off teaching everything you need to know about messagebox. So let's go ahead and quickly look at the syntax for a message box. So we have two ways that we can use a message box. One is the simple way, which you're going to probably use the most, is just typing out the command message box and then followed by whatever text that you want to have displayed. And the last one is to actually add options to it, title to it, timeout, etc. So let's go over these quickly. If you've ever watched any programming tutorials before, you've probably seen that one of the first programming tutorials you ever encounter for each thing is the Hello World program. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a message box with the Hello World program. So let's go ahead and just type that out. Msgbox, comma, and then Hello World. We're going to save this and run it, and we end up with this little GUI with a OK button and the word hello world on it. So there's our first program. Now let's say that you don't want to do that. You want to get into more deeper things with the message box, where you're adding a title to it, etc., etc. We're going to go through all of those one at a time. So the first thing we're going to look at is title. If in this option here, if you noticed up at the very top, when you ran it, whatever you named your script, that is going to be the name that's up in the title bar. So what we're going to do is we're going to change it so that way we can actually control what the title is. So if I look up here in the syntax of it, I can see that I need one comma, then that puts me into the options, and then if I add another comma, that puts me into the title. So what I'm going to do here is I already have that first comma, so I'm going to add that second comma, and then whatever I put in here is going to be the title. So I'm just going to call this, put in the text name. So our title is going to be name, and then afterwards I put a comma, and then whatever text we want to have displayed in our message box. So if I run this again, instead of at the top it having the name of our script, now it has name. If I don't want to have anything up there, what I can do is I can just use the tab escape character. So I can just do tab or this in here, and now when I run it again, I will have absolutely nothing up there. Okay, so that's a little trick to get rid of any text up there. The next thing we're going to look at is the options. Now, the options is how the options work. It's a series of numbers that are added together, and that creates a unique value. And you're not going to likely memorize these things, so you're going to have to often, if you're creating message boxes, you're going to often have to refer to the documentation page. So if I look here, it gives me a list of all the numbers. So let's have a quick look at the first thing. So we're going to create, instead of it just having an OK button, this time what we're going to do is we're going to have an OK and a cancel button. So in the options, so if I look up here at my syntax, I can see that the parameter for options is the first thing after this. So I'm going to put a 1 there, which corresponds to the OK and cancel button. Now if I save this and run it, we now have an OK and a cancel button. But they don't actually do anything right now. We'll come back to that after we cover this. If I go back over to the documentation page, I can see that I have different options for different buttons, so I can pick whatever option that I want. So if I want yes, no, and cancel, I put a 3 there, etc., etc. The next is some icons. So let's say if I want to have an exclamation mark. Now I think built into this exclamation mark, I don't usually use these. I usually just use a default message box, but let's say that I want to add an exclamation mark, and I think it plays a sound with it as well. So what we're going to do is we're going to take this 48, and if we want to have this OK plus cancel button, I would add this 1 to this value here, which is going to give me a unique value of 49. So if I type in here that 48, which is the exclamation mark, and then I want to add the OK and cancel button, so I add 1 to it, which gives me 49. So now if I run this, and yes, we get that sound. So now we have that exclamation icon, plus we have our buttons. And I can, like I said, I can do the other ones as well. So I can have an asterisk info, right? So I'd do 64. If I want to have that, I would add 1 to it, so I'd have 65. Let's look at one of the last things. The thing that I actually use the most is always on top. So I'm going to make our message box exactly as it is now, but I'm also going to add it so that way it's always on top. So as a quick reference, so I don't forget, I have a bad habit of forgetting numbers. So I'm going to write that 49 there. I'm going to paste in the default code for always on top, and now I'm going to add 49 to it. So that gives me 93. So it'll be 262,193. Alright, so now what we'll have is a message box that always stays on top, has the exclamation mark, and has the OK and cancel button. Okay, and if I click here, I can see that it stays on top. If you have the site for AutoHotkey, up at the top you'll find this toolbar up here, and this icon right here is actually something somebody made. I don't know if AutoHotkey had built it themselves or if somebody actually made it and then they added it to this software here. But anyways, you can find this tool here, which is a lot better than having to go to the documentation every time, because now I can come through here and select the options that I want. I can add in the title, blah blah blah. I can add in any text that I want, new lines, etc. And then I can just copy and paste this into my script. I can also insert it in, but I don't like using these kind of things. I can just copy and paste it. So I have that copied. I'll just replace this line with that, and it'll do everything that I want. There we go. Okay, so like I said, that tools there is available if you have site for AutoHotkey. I suggest get site for AutoHotkey instead of having to go to the documentation all the time. But like I said before, most of the time you're just going to use a simple message box that says whatever. Right? Okay. The next thing we're going to look at is actually making it so that way we can interact with those buttons. Because right now, regardless of what button we press, so let's go back to our example of 1 and put some generic text. If I run this, regardless of what button I press, nothing's going to happen. So what we're going to do is we're going to introduce the next thing, which is going to be actually the topic for the third tutorial, but I'm going to introduce it a little bit here, which is conditional. So what we're going to do is we're going to use the conditional that's built in for Msgbox. The way we test it, whatever button is pressed, is we just type in here if Msgbox, and then we have whichever buttons that we have. So we know from our looking at the documentation that since we're using 1, we have an OK and a cancel button. So we're going to type in here, if the person presses the OK button, we're going to do this next thing. So if it's just one thing, I can just put it on its own line. I don't need to do anything, right? So if I only have one instruction to follow, if the person presses OK, I can do it without adding anything special to it. But if I have multiple lines that are included with it, so if the person presses OK and I want to execute multiple lines of code, what I need to do is enclose it in French braces. I'll come back to French braces and indentation, etc., when we get to the third tutorial, but for now, I think that'll be fine. Most of you probably already know this stuff anyways, but we'll come back to that. So if I have only one line, I don't need those braces, but if I have more than one line, I need to have braces. So if the person presses OK, what we're going to do is we're just going to pop up another message box that says you pressed OK. So because it's only one line, I don't need the French braces, but let's say if I want to print out 2 message boxes, then I would have to put them in braces. In other words, what's going to happen is this first one is only going to get executed if the person pressed OK, but the second one is going to get executed regardless. And that's not what I want. I want it only to get done if the person presses OK. So the second line, I have to make sure that all of it's enclosed in braces. Okay. Now, like I said before, Msgbox is incredibly useful for testing. Now this is what I would typically do to test a certain aspect. So let's say if I have a condition, I want to see if it's met true or not. Before I actually have my program spend hours doing a task, perhaps I'll put in a quick message box there to see if it's going in the right direction. So I'll test this, see if this message box pops up. Once I know that it's working okay, I can comment this out and I can put in the real code that I want. Okay, so what we're going to do is if the person presses OK, it's going to pop up a message box that says OK, else if message box. Now this else means that sometimes you're going to have 2 conditions that are true. So let's say if I have a value in a variable. So let's say if I have a number 3, right? Let's say I pick the number 3, I stored that in a variable, and then I do some tests. So the first test I'll do is, does it equal 3? If it equals 3, okay, do whatever. Then I might have, okay, it might not be 3, but is it 2? Or is it greater than 2? Right? Both of those are the exact same thing. So if it's 3, it's also greater than 2, because 3 is greater than 2. If I don't have this else, in here, it would do both. I'll come back to that later on in the third tutorial. But basically, both of those, if I use only an if statement rather than an else if, because both of those are true, because it does equal 3 and it is greater than 2, it would perform both of those tasks when I only really want it to perform the first task that rings true. So if I only want to perform one task, then I use else. So that way, if this first thing is true, it's going to completely ignoring checking the second thing. And like I said, in the third tutorial, we'll go way, way deeper in this. So else if the person pressed cancel, we are going to do this next task, which is just pop up a message box. And our message box is going to say you pressed cancel. Okay, I'll separate those a little bit so you see it a little bit easier. So we're going to pop up our message box with 2 buttons on it. If you press OK, it'll execute this message box. If you press cancel, it'll execute this message box. And like I said, these message boxes are just stand-ins for something that you would actually want it to do. Okay, so we're going to start out by pressing the OK button, and then it says we pressed OK because that rang true. Okay, and it will run the program again, and this time we're going to press cancel. So it says you pressed cancel, and then that's it. Now I'll point out that when we have these 2 buttons here with the OK and cancel, the X up at the top is also tied to this cancel. So if I press this red X up here, we will still execute this cancel being true. Right? You pressed cancel. Okay, so that's that. The next thing we're going to do is what I'm going to do is I'm going to make it so that we're going to create a little program. So I'm going to say, do you want to exit the script? If we press OK, what we're going to do is we're going to pop up a message box that says that we want to exit. Now, because I'm going to have more than one line in here, so I need to enclose my stuff in braces. So I'm going to say, I'm going to put in here, I'm going to pop up a message box that says the script is about to exit, and then what we're going to do is we're going to include our exit app command. So if we press OK, do you want to exit? OK. So we're going to pop up the message that says we're about to exit, and then we're actually going to exit. If not, we're just going to say something else. Not exiting. Whatever. Okay. So here we go. This is our first program that actually tests conditions to do different things. So if I save this, if I press cancel, it's not exiting, and if I look, I can see that the script is still running. But if I press OK, it'll say the script is about to exit, and then if I come down here, I can see that it actually has exited. Okay, so that's that. The last thing that we're going to look at is the timeout. So sometimes you might want to have a message box that pops up, but if you don't interact with it after a set amount of time, it'll disappear on its own. So that's the last parameter. So we're going to put this in here. We're going to put a timeout amount. Now, once again, this is in the documentation. You can go through and look through the timeout. So for example, here it says that the maximum timeout that you can put into it is the equivalent of 24.8 days, which is this amount of seconds, right? I don't think you're going to need that, but just know that it's there. So what we're going to do is we're going to make it so that way if we don't interact with it within 5 seconds, it's going to time out on its own, and then we are going to test to see if it timed out. So we're going to use that else if. Let me else if message box. And then we're going to use the last thing here, the timeout. So if this timeout gets triggered, it's going to put a value into a variable, and we're going to check that variable. Or at least that's how I assume that it's going to work. So if it encounters the timeout, what we're going to do is we're going to pop up a message box that says too slow. Okay, we're going to run the program again, and we're just going to let it time out on its own after 5 seconds. And there we go. So we encountered it timed out on its own, so we could have done anything that we wanted, but in our case we just used a message box. And those other things that we could do is the purpose of these tutorials. Right? We're going to be slowly introducing all the different things you can do with AutoHotkey. But for right now, Msgbox is a great way to test things and display how things work. Okay, so that concludes the Msgbox portion, and I'll see you in the next one.